Three personal admonitions. First, no doubt like each of you, I am truly thankful beyond measure to be an American citizen. Second admonition, as stated by many, especially the American Legion, and I quote, "Our freedom is not for free. It comes as a result of sacrifices and countless brave men and women who served our country in the armed forces. Tomorrow is Veterans Day, and today is the 244th anniversary of the founding of the United States Marine Corps. So we have a lot to be thankful for. The members of the armed forces, be they Army, Coast Guard, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, all put on the uniform for a reason. And in honor of Veterans Day, I'd like to start today's program with a pledge of allegiance to the flag. Please rise. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I want to particularly thank you for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon and deciding to come here. My belief is that your decision will be neither forgotten nor regretful because of our speaker today. Jack F. McManus was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Following high school, Jack entered the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, graduating in 1957 with a BS in physics. Immediately upon graduation, he reported for active duty in the United States Marine Corps. After serving for 3 years, he received his honorable discharge and became a very successful electronics engineer. As a matter of fact, he received a special commendation from the United States Air Force for development of a specialized power transmitter needed for the nose cone radar of our fighter jets. He was well on his way to being a superior engineer with a great career ahead of himself in electronics. However, this man is a truth seeker. He is a fact finder. And he looked at life through a different lens. That's what makes him so very unique and very special as an American citizen. He was invited to go to a John Birch Society one evening in 1964. He had some questions before going to the meeting, and he had questions after he came out of the meeting. But he went to the meeting at the invitation of a friend of his. After much thoughtful consideration and decision-making, he decided in 1966 to become a member of the John Birch Society. For the next 50 years, Jack both worked with and led the educational mission of the JBS through speeches, articles, newspaper columns, radio broadcasts, TV appearances, the internet, and of course, the 6 books that he wrote. In addition, from 1991 to 2016, he served as president of the GBS. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not hyperbole to say that Jack has alerted, informed, awakened, educated, and inspired hundreds of thousands of people, actually millions, myself being one of them, to both facts and truths that are based on our belief and trust in God Almighty and our commitment to our Constitution. I read once that Daniel Webster said, "There is nothing more powerful than the truth, and often nothing as strange as the truth." So the power and the strangeness of truth is something that he sought to understand, shares with people willingly and openly. After concluding his term of service for 25 years as the president of JBS, he stepped away, and now he's the president emeritus of the JBS. Ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and respected colleague, Jack McManus.
Thank you, Denny, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm supposed to flip this on now, and now we should have a different microphone, and it's working. All right, well, that's always helpful. Helpful when the microphone works, yes, indeed. Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm grateful to all who are here, giving up some of your time to listen to what we have to say is much appreciated, and I hope to make your decision to come fruitful, to listen to what I have to say, and maybe challenge a few of your beliefs. But I've been challenging audiences and individuals for practically all of my adult life. And in most cases, it's been an absolute delight. If what I have to offer fortifies existing beliefs and attitudes, that will also be well worth my time. I want to thank especially my good friend, Denny Golden, who has, with his wife Monica, sitting right here, been listening and accepting what I offer for many years and even opened the door of their home for me to stay. Now, it's customary to start off a speech, even a serious speech, with an attempt at humor, which I will now attempt. I want to tell you about two burglars who on an ordinary evening are ransacking a home of a family who happen to be away. They're going about their business unimpeded, loading up their bags with everything they could steal. And all of a sudden they heard a voice and said, "The Lord is with you." And they went like this, a little bit shocked. Well, that stopped them for a moment, but nothing further happened, so they continued stealing whatever they could find. But again, the voice interrupted, saying, "The Lord is with you." One of the burglars had a flashlight, and he shone it around the room and discovered a bird cage in the corner over here, and there was a parrot. And it was the parrot who was saying, "The Lord is with you," right? So he told his partner, "It's only a silly parrot. We have nothing to worry about." Then he lowered the flashlight down to the bottom of the bird cage, and he saw a rather large Doberman Pinscher. And at that point, the parrot said, "Sick 'em, Lord." Now, does that apocryphal story hold a lesson for all of us? I think it does. The burglars represent thieves who are stealing our country. The parrot sounding the alarm stands for the John Birch Society and others. And the Doberman Pinscher stands for the thousands of society members and friends who are working to stop the burglar whose thievery of the greatest nation on earth is proceeding. Needs to be stopped. If these thieves aren't deterred, our country will become a mere province in a worldwide tyranny whose powerfully situated and determined thieves mean to rule the world. So the story does apply to some degree. And although the John Birch Society has slowed down some of their progress, exposed some of their plans, reveals the identity of some of the burglars, much still needs to be done. We need more Dobermans. Right? Well, let's get basic here now, and let's talk about who was John Birch. I don't know how many times I've been on a radio show where the radio announcer, the fellow interviewing me, said, "When did John Birch start the John Birch Society?" He didn't start the John Birch Society. John Birch was killed in 1945. The society didn't start until 1958. So how did it come about? Well, John Birch was a Baptist missionary from Georgia. He went to China as a volunteer missionary to spread his beliefs in 1940. China had been invaded already by the Japanese, and in 1938, as a matter of fact, the Japanese arrived in China. The Chinese military had two factions to fight against the Japanese. They had communists led by Mao Zedong, and they had the anti-communists led by Chiang Kai-shek, who was aided by a small contingent of American military that were known as the Flying Tigers. It was an arm of the Army Air Corps, and I think some of you probably know that there wasn't any U.S. Air Force until after World War II, that the air arm of our government and our military at the time was the Army Air Corps, right? So there were three groups involved in war in China: Japanese invaders, Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong, and Chinese nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, who was aided by a rather small American detachment. During his initial years in China, John didn't get involved in the ongoing war in China. But after he learned about the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, he felt obliged to participate. Military retaliation for that attack was begun on April 18, 1942, with the famous raid over Tokyo, conducted by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and some very brave men who went and dropped some bombs on Tokyo. Doolittle and his fellow raiders took off from an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific. They dropped their bombs on Tokyo, and knowing that they didn't have enough fuel to return to their aircraft carrier, they followed instructions to head for China, and when the fuel ran out, either crash land the plane or bail out and let it go. Right? Most of the pilots and crewmen survived. Some were never heard from again. Any who were captured by the Japanese were probably executed immediately. There were 80 men who volunteered for this dangerous mission. Each of the 16 B-25 bombers had a 5-man crew. That adds up to 80 men. After delivering the blow to Tokyo, Doolittle and his crew successfully bailed out of their plane in China and were hiding in a small vessel tied up at a pier in a Chinese village. Missionary John Birch happened to be in that village, and he was approached by a Chinese fellow who said, "I think you're an American, and if you are, there are people in that boat over there who need you." So John Birch went over to the boat, and he knocked on the door, and he said, "Are there any Americans in there?" And one of Doolittle's men immediately said, "Don't open the door, it's a trap, we'll be captured by the Japanese." So John asked again, he rapped on the door, and he said, "Are there any Americans in there?" At that point, another one of the Americans said, "There ain't no Chinese who can speak English with a southern accent. It has to be an American." And it was an American. So they opened the door, and John Birch brought Jimmy Doolittle and his crew back to the American sector in China. Well, at that point, General Claire Chennault, who was the head of the Flying Tigers and that American detachment there, he asked John to join the American forces. And John had already considered that, and he said he'd be happy to be their chaplain. And Chennault said, "I got a chaplain, I don't need another chaplain. I need you, an intelligence operative who can live amongst the Chinese people, who can do intelligence work for me anywhere in China." And so John said, "Okay, if that's what you want, that's what I'll do." So he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the United States Army Air Corps on July 4th, 1942, and he served with absolute distinction for the next 3 years. He even constructed, with help of course, constructed small airports for the Allied troops to use. He reported on Japanese and communist troop movements. He did this, he did that. Every American who got to China in that portion of the war heard about and started revering John Birch. He became a legend in his own time. Right? He could dress like the Chinese, he's familiar with the Chinese language. So he accepted, became a lieutenant, and became an extremely valuable intelligence asset, reporting on what Japanese forces were doing in a very large area of China. He actually became legendary. Some of his exploits reported on Jap troop movements and then the activities of the communist Chinese forces. According to many, and especially to his parents, who I got to know happily, who were living in Georgia, Macon, Georgia, they felt that John should have been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And from what I know about John Birch, I agree. He never did get the big medal. But he carried out his dangerous work for more than 3 full years, without interruption, by the way. Only 9 days after the war with Japan ended in August of 1945, he was sent on a mission while wearing the uniform of a captain now in the United States Army to find out if the Chinese military contingent nearby was friend or foe. So he and a Chinese officer friend and a loyal companion approached the Chinese unit and immediately discovered they were communists. The communists disarmed the two of them, bayoneted them both, shot John and his companion. John died on the spot. The Chinese officer lived to tell what had happened. His name was Tung, T-U-N-G. John's parents were soon informed that their son had perished, but they were not told why. They tried very hard to find out what happened. Why did he die? How did he die? And so forth. Not until China had been sufficiently betrayed and turned over to Mao Zedong by our government in 1949 did they find out the details about John's death. By then, US government officials were shielding the communists, refusing to allow publication of their criminal activity, and so on. Several years later, a man named Robert Welch, living in Massachusetts, came across the name of John Birch while, as he said, reading some dusty old government reports in a congressional library. He was researching the communist penetration of our country. And he got help from Senator William Noland of California. Eventually, in 1954, he wrote a small book called The Life of John Birch. I have a copy of that here, and I can show you one of the original books, a copy of The Life of John Birch. You can see it's not a very large book, right? And it catapulted Robert Welch to prominence among anti-communists all across the United States. The book won him many friends. 2 years earlier, he had written a separate book entitled May God Forgive Us. And it was, may God forgive us for betraying China and Chiang Kai-shek, for delivering huge amounts of munitions to the wrong people, and helping the murderous Chinese who eventually took over all of China. Mao Zedong's leadership in China earned recognition in the Guinness Book of Records, the most murderous governmental system in all history. And I hate to say it, but our government helped them into power. So Robert Welch turned out to be an unusual combination of scholarship and determination. He was born in December of 1899. He always said that he was older than the 20th century and therefore it should listen to him. Right? We wish that more people had, and we wish more people would still listen to what Robert Welch had to say. He's now deceased, of course. Right? His parents raised him on a farm in North Carolina. Right? He was taught at home by a school teacher mother. He was reading at age 2, doing multiplication tables at age 4, became proficient in elementary algebra at age 6, and devoured the 9-volume History of the World by an author named Ridpath at age 7. Right? He was sent to high school into the 3rd year of the usual 4-year program at age 10. After graduation at age 12, he went on to the University of North Carolina, and he raised funds for himself by tutoring other students. Right? In fact, he became known as Savvy. Right? He was a guy who knew the answers to a lot of different things, even though he was just a squirt. Right? We have some pictures of Robert Welch in that situation at North Carolina, and here he is, 10, 11 years old, and all of the others are 6-footers or close to it. Right? So he graduated from the University of North Carolina at age 16. He decided to enter the Naval Academy. 2 years at the Naval Academy, with World War I now over, 1918, after the U.S. had entered the struggle and won it, he resigned from Annapolis and moved to Massachusetts to study law at Harvard Law School. He never intended to be a lawyer, but he wanted to know as much as possible about law because he intended to be a businessman. It was while he was at Harvard Law School in his junior year that he tangled with Professor Felix Frankfurter. Some of you might know that Felix Frankfurter became a member of the Supreme Court. Right? And he was as left as Robert Welch was right. Right? So he resigned from that, and then he decided to get into the business world. He wanted to become a manufacturer. And so he said to himself, I have to figure out what would be the best thing to manufacture. And he spent a lot of time thinking about it. He didn't want to produce large machinery or furniture or something large. He wanted to produce something that would be so immediately consumed and enjoyed that the customer would want more. He decided the best product to meet his standards was candy. Candy. So he and his younger brother eventually built the very successful James O. Welch Candy Company, the makers of fudge bars and sugar babies and sugar daddies and so on. If anybody ever asks you on a trivia contest who was the inventor of the sugar daddy, you can say Robert Welch, the man who founded the John Birch Society. And that happened quite by chance. He was based in the Boston area. The candy company was actually in Cambridge, which is just across the river from Boston. And he had to deliver a whole shipment of fudge bars. They made fudge bars as well, to Worcester, Massachusetts, where Denny and I spent 4 years at Holy Cross College, about 45 miles west of Boston. But it was a very hot day, and he had it loaded up his car. Now, if you remember, you're old enough to remember, cars back in that era used to have a back shelf, right? And there was no air conditioning in cars, right? So the fudge that he put up on the back shelf of the car was subject to the sunlight coming in, and it all melted and oozed all over the car, and he couldn't sell it. He could sell what he had kept in the well of the back seat of the car and in the front seat and so on. So he was disappointed that some of his product was spoiled and so on. But he managed to complete the operation. And the next day he went out to clean off his car, and it had hardened. The fudge had oozed, and now it had hardened. And he broke off a piece, and he tasted it, and that was the first sugar daddy. Now that's going to win you $1 million on a quiz show, right? Who invented the sugar daddy? Robert Welch did, right? Things like that happened in chance, but by chance. Well, Robert Welch became quite thoroughly disgusted with Felix Frankfurter and what he was handing out to the students at Harvard Law School. And one of the points that he made that I know of was that Frankfurter was always saying that there was an incontrovertible gulf between labor and management, that they would always be fighting with each other, and that it would be a terrible, terrible thing to see, and therefore the American system had to be changed. You know? A real leftist. And Robert Welch knew that that was false. He said, no, labor and management are two arms of the same body, and they work together to produce. And that's what has made America great. But Frankfurter kept it up, and Robert Welch kept trying to stop him and so forth, and finally he got so disgusted, he walked out of Harvard Law School and he never got his degree. Right. Now those classes at Harvard, at that point, there were 300 people in the class. And they had it in a big auditorium. Frankfurter was so popular, everybody wanted to be taught by Felix Frankfurter. Well, some of them got taught by Robert Welch, right? Well, Robert Welch was always studying history and current events. In 1934, he wrote an essay entitled "A Weight on My Shoulders." It was a classic objection to President Franklin Roosevelt's socialistic New Deal. And in that, he wrote this paragraph. Remember now, this is 1934. The glory that is passing in America that I was born in, that was given me by courageous and far-seeing men, many of whom died for that purpose, that I grew up in, went to school in, and loved more every year as I came to understand what a miraculous achievement it was as compared with any other social group at any place or at any time in the history of the world. My America is being made over into a carbon copy of thousands of despotisms that have come before. 1934. Was he right about that? I fear he was. Let me interject my own far shorter summation of what Robert Welch was saying in 1934. My own admiration for what the founders of our country created isn't a paragraph in length like his. It's only one single sentence. But my summation says this: America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Now, I have a good friend today who used to be Donald Trump's pilot. He actually worked for the man for 10 years. After a career as a military pilot and then somewhat in the commercial, he took a job with Donald Trump to be his personal pilot. And he flew him everywhere. He flew him here, he flew him there, he flew him there. I said, well, you got to know Donald Trump, and this was before the 2016 election. I had just met this guy. I said, what kind of a man was he? He said he was tremendous. I loved working for him. He was very fair, he was very honest, it was fun, it was great. I wish I was still with him. I said, well, why did you leave? He said, well, I told him he needed a new plane, and so he got a new pilot. Which is actually what happened. So my friend, I said to him, can we get a message through to Donald? He said, we can try. How do we go about it? He said, well, there's a woman at Trump Tower in New York City who's known as the gatekeeper. Nobody gets in to see Donald without going through her, right? And her name is Rhoda something. I've forgotten her last name. So he said, we type up a message, we send it to Rhoda, and we ask her to give it to Donald. So I did exactly that. I put it on one sheet of paper, no heading on the paper, no signature at the bottom, just the message. And the message is what I've given you. America became great, not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Now, just imagine if he had adopted that after already saying, make America great, MAGA hats and MAGA flags and everything else. If he had said that, he would have provided a tremendous bit of information for the American people. But Donald Trump, I have to confess, I voted for him, and I'll probably vote for him again. But he doesn't take advice. He's his own man. He's got it all figured out. He's a typical New Yorker. He's got all the answers, right? But I'm a typical New Yorker, too. I grew up in Brooklyn. I don't have all the answers, but I have some. But anyhow, we tried to get that message through to Donald, and I guess we didn't succeed. We'll go back to Robert Welch. He took a trip to England after World War II had ended, and he found that country, our ally, being destroyed from within by socialists. Now, I pause here in discussing Robert Welch in order to make a point that most politicians, educators, and mass media will not make. They don't understand. My point is simply this. Socialism is more deadly than its blood brother, communism. Okay? Why? Why? Well, a group of communists might seize control of your country, but there is still resistance because they have seized control of your country, usually in lightning fashion. So they have to create a secret police force, an NKVD, a KGB, or something to maintain their seizure by terrorizing the population, right? There is still resistance when communism takes over a country. On the other hand, a group of socialists who gain ultimate power over a country have achieved the ultimate goal by getting the people to vote themselves into the system. And they destroyed resistance in the process. The people have asked for socialism. Hence, I conclude that socialism is more dangerous than communism. Now, you go down the list of Democrat candidates running for president today, they are all socialists. All, every single one of them, right? Some of them proudly about it. Bernie Sanders, for instance, right? And lots of others are socialists. And they want to do to our country is to take power, but to destroy resistance in the process. How many Americans realize that the book known as the Communist Manifesto, written by Marx and Engels in 1848, was originally supposed to be called the Socialist Manifesto? I have a copy here. Communist Manifesto by Marx, mostly by Marx. Engels gets a little bit of a handshake for it, right? 1848, right? Marx and Engels knew, after they had finished writing this, that there were some socialists operating in Europe during that period, and they've given socialism a bad name. So they reluctantly changed their plan and decided to call the booklet the Communist Manifesto. Right? It could very easily have been the Socialist Manifesto. Now, what does it say? Well, on page 25 of this rather important book, we see the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. They're all listed numerically, right? Number 2, the heavy progressive income tax. We have it. Number 5, centralization of credit in the state, in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. We have it. It's called the Federal Reserve. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools. We have it. We have it. Right? We are adopting the Communist Manifesto. Now, I only mentioned 3 of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. In fact, we have all 10 of those planks, either totally or partly, and it all happened in the 20th century. It's what Robert Welch was talking about when he said, my country is being converted into a carbon copy of thousands of despotisms that have come before. Right? Today, the socialists call themselves progressives. Well, it's a nice name, right? But it's a lie. There's nothing progressive about it. Right? Here in America, they come from both the Democrat and the Republican parties, not just all Democrats. Right? Consider the Communist Manifesto for a few moments. Right? It calls for abolition of property. Right? It states as one of its goals replacement of home education by social. They hate the idea of homeschooling. Right? It denounces the claptrap about the family. They want to destroy the family. It attacks bourgeois marriage, does it? It aims to abolish countries and nationalities, have one world government, a new world order, really. It seeks to abolish all religion and morality. Do we see morality taking a hit these days? Ooh, do we ever? And it announces as a goal, they want to win the battle of democracy. Democracy. Karl Marx and Engels liked democracy. And here we are in America where 90% of the American people believe we've been a democracy all these years and never anything else but. And what do? They toss away the Constitution and they go ahead and do what they want. And we allow them to do it. We American citizens, because we just don't know. Right? The Communist Manifesto even discusses how some of its initial goals will of necessity fail and replaced by further inroads upon the old social order. They will construct programs that they know will fail so that they can put in something even worse and the people will accept it. This is happening right now as we approach 2020. Obamacare has been a failure. Even some of the would-be rulers of the Obamacare consider it a failure. So we got to fix it by making it worse. That's exactly what they're saying. So Obamacare will now be replaced by something more comprehensive, more costly, more totalitarian. That's what the proposals being offered today will do. Proposals suggested by candidates who want to be known as progressives. What a lie. What a lie. Let's go back to Robert Welch. He thought for a time that gaining political office for himself would be a wise course to follow. So he ran for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts in 1950. He came in second in a 4-man race. But coming in second in a political race means you might as well have been 16th, right? You lost. During the 1950 campaign, he met a lot of very good people in Massachusetts who were supporters of him and his candidacy. but he found even them to be poorly informed about the U.S. government system. It is, of course, not a democracy, it's a republic. It is not the unrestrained rule of a majority, which is a democracy, but a government bound down by the chains of a constitution, and that is a republic. The Constitution, if honored, will impede the aims of a mob. A republic features the rule of law. A good republic restrains government. And so the founders of our nation gave us not a Greek-style democracy, but a Roman-style republic. After his defeat in 1950, running for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, Robert Welch decided that what was needed is an educational program in cities and towns across the state to fill in what was missing from the poor education the people had received even then, right? I went to grade school in the 40s and into the 50s, and I never heard about the difference between a democracy and a republic, right? Hardly anybody knew the difference and that there was a difference. There were people saying it's a democratic republic or it's a Republican democracy, and just confusion compounded over and over again. So Robert Welch started an educational program in cities and towns across the state to fill in what was missing from the poor education the people had been given. Robert Welch found even then that very few people despised democracy and put together a republic and wanted a republic. Nor did they understand the worth of the Declaration of Independence. Now, our country started in 1776. We didn't get the Constitution until 1789, right? I love to say of the Declaration of Independence that it starts off almost the first sentence, very few after the first sentence. It presents the thunderous assertion, and I mean thunderous. They said men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Right? Government didn't grant the rights. God did. But that can't be taught in the government schools today. You cannot teach that in the government schools today. The British didn't want America to break away, so there was a war. And the upstart Americans won. That war had been fought by a government under the hastily formed Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation established a national government that couldn't tax, couldn't function as intended, couldn't raise a military, and so on. So after the British gave up and went back to their homeland, a constitutional convention was formed to revise the Articles. But the men who attended that gathering in 1787 in Philadelphia, they didn't revise the Articles of Confederation, they trashed them. They said, get rid of it, let's start fresh. They built a republic. And Benjamin Franklin was met outside the Constitutional Convention by a woman who said, sir, what have you given us? A republic or a monarchy? And he looked at her and he said, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. If you can keep it. Wow. A lot of wisdom in that as well. So we did try to keep it. What do some of the other founding fathers say about democracy? Well, I have a booklet here, and we have copies for it on the book table over there if anybody would like to get one. Here's my Constitution, by the way. A republic, if you can keep it, right? Anybody could sit down and read this and not have to get up for a glass of water. I mean, it's that short. Right? And there's some amazing quotes in this. John Adams, who was the vice president to Washington and then the second president of our country, he said there was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. That was his attitude about it. Alexander Hamilton said, "We are a Republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." Right? George Washington agreed. And as he took office for president, he declared at his inauguration address that he committed himself to the preservation of the Republican model of government. Right? And James Madison, aptly named the father of the Constitution, wrote in Federalist Paper number 10, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths." Imagine standing up in front of a high school class today, or the whole school gathered in the auditorium, and telling them that democracies have in general been as short in their life as they are violent in their death. Right? But that's what the man who was the founder, the father of the Constitution. Why did they call him the father of the Constitution? Because he took the notes at the Constitutional Convention. And it was from his notes that much of the Constitution was eventually put down and ratified. Now, that statement of Madison and some of the others, those statements appear in what is called the Federalist Papers. The essays that were written in New York by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay to explain the Constitution and want the people in that area to get a hold of their legislators and so forth, and please ratify the Constitution. We've read it, we like it, so forth. How many of those people in New York State had gone to school? Hardly any of them. Where did they learn to read? Where did they learn to read difficult reading, which is the Federalist Papers? They learned it at their mother's knee, or they learned it at church. Right? The farmers in New York State were better educated than college graduates today in many cases. Right? They voted yes. Well, one after another, the states ratified the Constitution, and it was finally passed by enough states so that we were going to have a new Constitution. If you go to Delaware, you look in Delaware and you see every one of the license plates on an automobile, it says the first state. Right? But there are 13 original states, aren't there? Where did they get off calling themselves the first state? They were the first to ratify the Constitution. They beat Pennsylvania by 5 days, and Pennsylvania has never forgiven them. Now, George Mason of Virginia was not at the Constitutional Convention. Maybe you've heard his name. I think they named a college after him down there now, right? When he read what had been produced, he insisted that it needed a Bill of Rights. We don't want to take anything for granted. We want to write them down. So he created a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. A promise was made to him and others who saw the need for a Bill of Rights. It said that they would add the Bill of Rights as soon as the Constitution achieved ratification. And those were amazing days. The politicians kept their promise. And the Constitution did add the Bill of Rights. What is the Bill of Rights? It's a list of what federal government can and should do, but mostly what it can't do. Right? I don't know how many places I've gone where I've asked people, where do you get your rights to speak, to publish, to assemble, to do this, do that, or everything else? You know, high school students, I've spoken to a lot of high school students. Hardly ever did I ever get anybody to say the answer was from God Almighty. Right? They just don't know. They're not being taught. So left alone, each state could strive to be the best state. the one where government intrusion into the lives of the people would be minimal. That's the Constitution as it's written. That's what it should be. Each state is automatically encouraged to be the one where a citizen would want to raise a family, want to build a business, pay less taxation, face less harassment, and so forth. This element of Americanism still exists to some degree, but it's being destroyed by oppressive rule from government, from the federal government. Right? The sense of competition is right there in the Constitution of the United States. Let the states compete to be the better state, and what do you get when you have competition? You get excellence. You destroy competition, you have one power ruling everybody, you get degradation, you get tyranny, right? Well, maybe some of you have heard the motto of the John Birch Society. It's simple. It said, "This is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way." Right? You put that on the bumper sticker, as we have done, and put it on your car, and sometimes your car, will you get back and you see mud all over your car or something. But Robert Welch said that and said it often. And for that, he was labeled by enemies of the nation's mass media, in the nation's mass media, for condemning democracy. Right? Robert Welch was hounded by people who said, well, you don't like democracy, and therefore you're no good. Right? They didn't give him a chance to explain what he meant. Yes, he did condemn it, and yes, he called it a fraud. Did the mass media explain his admiration for the republic? No, of course not. And that's one of the many misrepresentations about him and the society given to the American people. Interestingly, there's a black comedian that I never heard of until just a few days ago, and he recently said about the Second Amendment, he said, we have a Second Amendment just in case the first doesn't work. You get it? You get it. Perhaps you've heard the John Birch Society's claim that our nation is being victimized by a conspiracy. That's a word you're being cautioned not to use today. It might be okay to discuss the mafia conspiracy or a conspiracy that seeks to destroy freedom and establish totalitarian government, but use it as we do because that's what we believe. I could supply numerous examples of conspiracy at work. In fact, we have a book over there called The Shadows of the Conspiracy, and we have a lot more besides that. Now, in the 1920s, an interesting thing happened. There were some good people in government, in the War Department specifically, which is now the Defense Department. That was changed after World War II. These people decided that citizenship training of troops during peacetime would be a good idea. You got a lot of time, you know. You can train them in military tactics and strategy and so forth, but you've also got enough time, because they're not fighting a battle, to give them some civics training, right? So they produced a 75-page book entitled Training Manual Number 2000-25. It defined democracy as follows. A government of the masses, authority derived through mass meeting or any other form of direct expression, results in mobocracy. Attitude toward property is communistic, negating property rights. Attitude toward law is that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it be based on deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, or impulse, without restraint or regard to consequences, results in demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, and anarchy. And that was the Army War Training Manual in 1928. Right on. Right on. It had to go. It was correct in every detail. In 1934, officials of the Roosevelt administration, taking the road down to socialism, ordered the removal of that training manual and the destruction of all copies. A few years later, in 1936, Senator Homer Bone, B-O-N-E, of the state of Washington, during remarks given on the floor of the Senate, called for complete repudiation of the 1928 Army Training Manual. By then, even finding a copy of the manual had become almost impossible. Decades later, in an article appearing in a 1973 issue of Military Review magazine, an Army lieutenant colonel named Paul Parham discussed the suppression ordered by the Roosevelt administration about that Army war manual, and noted that the term democracy appears on one hand to be a key importance and holds some peculiar significance for communists. He nailed it. But there weren't any more of these books around. They'd all been confiscated and destroyed. So in 1952, the Army came out with a new book, and I have a copy of the new one. It's called The Soldier's Guide, right? And it dutifully described what is a democracy. And this one's all wrong. 1952. Meaning of democracy. Because the United States is a democracy, the majority of our people decide how our government will be organized and run, and that includes the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, and so forth. Incredible. Incredible. And this happened in your lifetime. Certainly in my lifetime. On and on we go. Meaning of democracy. Defined by the US government in 1952 in the Soldier's Guide. No thanks, right? Now, like most Americans, I never knew any of this history. I'm a college graduate. I took some courses in this and that, a lot of scientific courses mostly. I never knew any of this history. I had to learn it from the John Birch Society. I dare say that millions of Americans now know that it...
Jack, you drop your mic.
Drop the mic.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Let's give this fellow a hand. I mean, we... I had to learn this from the John Birch Society. We're occasionally told that we live in a Republican democracy or a democratic republic, right? That's just mishmash. That's like some kind of hash you don't like. Because of this and more we never learned, we're losing our freedom and we're losing our country. And the loss is not to a foreign power, but to homegrown characters who have gained positions in government and elsewhere and mean to create a new world order. You've heard that phrase, right? We call these people insiders, or we call them the deep state. We have a good book over there about the deep state. I hope that some of you will get a copy. It is these people who are controlling much of what our government does, and anyone who wants to spread the truth might start with what I stated previously. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Right? If the federal government isn't given power to do something in the Constitution, and that's this really thick book, the Constitution, which has the Declaration of Independence in it as well, then it can't do it, or it shouldn't do it, and somebody should stop them if they try to do it. Because the principles of our republic aren't understood, government gets away with virtually anything a majority in Congress wants. Example, Article 1 of the Constitution says, in Article 1, Sentence 1, in the Constitution. This is the very first sentence. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. I mean, that's pretty clear. The only body of government granted power to make a law is Congress. But presidential executive orders have become very common. Right? The method of making law by executive order trashes the very first sentence in the Constitution. How many Americans today know that the incredibly powerful Environmental Protection Agency was created not by a law passed by Congress, but by an executive order signed by Richard Nixon? Right? The Environmental Protection Agency is likely the most powerful agency of government today. During the 1990s, a man named Paul Begala, Begala, served as the top aide to President Clinton, who had just signed an executive order for something, and I don't remember what it was. Begala displayed knowledge of what had occurred, but approved the processes. In a front-page report in the New York Times, he expressed his glee. He said, "Stroke of the pen, law of the land, kinda cool." And he got away with it. And he is still a guest on Sunday morning television news broadcasts and so on. There was a time in America when such dangerous disrespect for the American system of government would have resulted in outrage and repudiation. Birch Society members knew what was happening and what Begala was really referring to. But let's move on. What else? The Supreme Court makes law. That's the other branch of government, the third, right? But Congress alone has the power to make law. The Supreme Court made law with Roe v. Wade. I remember some guy, some character, a comedian and so forth. Oh, Roe v. Wade, that's 2 ways of getting across the Potomac. Ha, ha, ha. While millions of infants are being aborted in the womb. The Constitution, if honored, says that only the Congress, not the other 2 branches of government, can make law. The Constitution empowers only the government to declare war and send forces into battle. The last time that was done was right after Pearl Harbor in 1941, and we won the war. We've gone to war several times since without a declaration of war, and we haven't won the war ever since 1945. Does it have anything is that the reason why that we didn't declare war? Yeah, partly the reason. In 2002, President George W. Bush was anxious to reinvade Iraq. This would have been the second raid into Iraq. We got to get the weapons of mass destruction. We got to get Saddam Hussein. We got to invade Iraq, all right? Well, a body of the U.S. House of Representatives got together. They called it the Foreign Affairs Committee. And at that gathering, one of the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, there were 45 of them, he stood up. His name was Ron Paul, a Texas congressman. And he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I would like to introduce a motion to declare war on Iraq. And I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the Constitution that says only Congress can send us to war. And so that was debated for a little bit. And then the chairman of the committee, Henry Hyde from Chicago, he told Ron Paul, Ron, your motion is an anachronism. We don't do that anymore. We don't do that. Has it been repealed? Has it been amended? Is it no longer part of the Constitution? No, he just declared it an anachronism. And we did go to war for a second time in Iraq, and we're still paying for that. But we didn't win that one either. We're now in the 18th year of a war in Afghanistan without a declaration of war. We've stationed troops in scores of nations around the world. Our military has become the policeman of the world, something never intended by the founders. There is no authorization in the Constitution for federal involvement in medicine, transportation, energy, environment, education, and numerous other areas. We have a foreign aid program that gives away money, and that's unconstitutional as well. The U.S. is now the greatest debtor nation in all history, $22 trillion and climbing. The Congress was given power to coin money, not to print money. The passage wanted the government to form a mint to take the precious metals of the people, gold and their silver, and shape it into coins of a fixed size, weight, and purity, and that's all. And so in 1792, a mint was formed, and that's what they did. That's all that they did. They didn't issue money, they coined money. They coined the money of the people, and they didn't even charge them for it. They did it as a service. Now, coinage of money of fixed size, weight, and value is very, very important in building commerce. Right? Not only do current leaders enact unconstitutional legislation, they refuse to carry out duties assigned them by the Constitution. Example, Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution says, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them from invasion." That's in the Constitution. Right? If 20 million enter our country illegally by crossing the southern border, is that not an invasion? Thanks to President Trump, the invasion has been stopped, but the 20 million people are still here. Most of them. And if he isn't reelected, we can expect a resumption of the illegal flow. Robert Welch started the John Birch Society at a meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana in December of 1958. He spoke to them for 2 full days. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. Right? Never a political organization nominating or backing candidates. The society was named and remains solely educational. People who agree with Robert Welch's assessment of America's strengths and America's internal enemies don't have to be told who to vote for. They already know. Right? So Robert Welch formed an educational organization. Why just an educational organization? Why not have a military arm? Why not do this? Why not do something else? No. Thomas Jefferson gave us an excellent answer. He said, we're skipping a page here. Thomas Jefferson said, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power." Absolutely true. And that's the John Birch Society. Thomas Jefferson said, "Inform their discretion by education." Other founders like James Madison, George Washington agreed. Jefferson also summarized the importance of education in very few words. He said, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be." Absolutely. The Supreme Court has made law, such as Roe v. Wade. But the Constitution, if honored, said only Congress can make law, not the other 2 branches. The Constitution empowers only the Congress to declare war and send forces into battle. The last time that was done, I've already mentioned, was December of 1941. Declared war against Japan after they had bombed Pearl Harbor. Our nation hasn't won a war. We didn't win in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and now Afghanistan. Any American who sees the dreadful harm in this has likely learned it from the John Birch Society. And there are people who don't like us alerting the people of America. And so they have called us anti-Semites, and they have called us racists. They have called us crackpots and kooks and you name it, any dirty adjective you can think of. We've had them all. We've had them all. But the interesting thing about it was the crescendo of the attack on the John Birch Society was raging in the early 1960s, and the society was growing. In 1966, it's like somebody pulled the cork out of the bathtub and all the water ran out, and the attacks stopped. We sit around at Birch headquarters every once in a while and say, how do we get attacked again? Let's get attacked again, right? Because it brought a lot of people to us, and it would do so again. There's no authorization in the Constitution for federal involvement in medicine, education, energy, education, transportation, environment, and so on. We have a foreign aid program that gives away money, incredible. The only intent of that called, what page am I on here? The only, well, let's talk about respectable politicians, publications, and radio and television commentators. I've always made myself available for these people, and I've been on radio stations all across the country, right? Television programs and so forth. I've delivered speeches in all 50 states. How many of you realize that when Obama was running for president, he talked about the fact that he intended to speak in all 57 states? He actually did that, right? Right? So I had to learn about a lot of things from the John Birch Society. One of the greatest foes of Robert Welch in the society was William Buckley, a man at the time I greatly admired. I didn't know then that Buckley was distorting what Robert Welch had said. I believe that some of his deceitful attacks in 1962 made sense. I even wrote a letter to his magazine congratulating him for an attack on Robert Welch. And they published my letter in the magazine, right? And shortly after that, I got a letter in the mail from a fellow who was a reader of the magazine, and he asked me a simple question. Are you basing your attitude about Robert Welch and the Birch Society about what the society and Welch have said, or what others have said of him? That hit me like this, you know. And I wrote back to the guy, I said, if there's anything you think I need to know, I'll be glad to take a look. And he invited me to some members, some meetings of the society. I went, I bought a set of books. One of the books I bought was a book called From Major Jordan's Diaries, all right? Interesting book. Major George Racy Jordan was a United States Army major stationed at Great Falls, Montana during World War II. And his job was to expedite the shipments of material that were coming from our country and being offloaded and put on other planes to go to Russia. And he dutifully went about his job, and then all of a sudden it started to be half of the plane was loaded with what they called diplomatic mail that he couldn't open, he couldn't inspect. Well, he got nervous about that. And so he complained to Washington about it and said, there's something wrong here. And they told him, shut up and do your job. Right? So he did shut up, but he continued to do his job. And then he started keeping a diary about what he was finding in some of the diplomatic mail. Right? What was he finding? Well, he was finding words that he'd never seen before. He found the word deuterium oxide. He found cobalt. He found other components of what would be an atomic bomb. And he still didn't know what it was all about, but he wrote it in his diary. And when the Soviets finally did produce an atomic bomb, and the newspapers even told him what the parts of the bomb really were. Then he said to himself, now I know what I was shipping to Russia, the plans and the parts to build an atomic bomb in 1944 and 45. Right? But he almost got fired from the Army for protesting the diplomatic mail that was going through his, right? So what we see is tremendous betrayal of the American people and our purpose and our Constitution and everything. In 1966, Robert Welch wrote a lengthy article entitled "The Truth in Time." In it, he answered a question that had been bothering me. I was already a member, and I had already joined the staff of the society. In it, he answered a question. I knew that high officials in our government were helping the communists. It was obvious to me by then. I'd read Major Jordan's diaries. I'd read several other books that were doing the same kind of information. But they were helping communists, and I didn't know why. In his essay he wrote in 1966, he said, the communist movement is only a tool of the total conspiracy. For me, that explained Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk and some other left-wing members of Congress and federal officials. Right? They weren't communists. They were above communists. The conspiracy had an arm called communism, but the conspiracy's body was bigger. Right? Today we call them the deep state. It all figured. We weren't being conquered from afar, right? The betrayal had been going on for a long time, such as in 1916 when President Woodrow Wilson won re-election on a solemn promise that he would never send American boys to fight in World War I, and he was planning to do that all the time he was saying he wouldn't. Right? The John Birch Society's educational campaigns have won numerous small but important battles. We stopped the drive for civilian police review boards designed to put appointed civilians between the police and their superiors. Right? Appointed individuals who would not take the side of the police, that's for sure. We stopped the ratification of the phony Equal Rights Amendment. That was far more for increasing government power than about equal pay for women. Our educational campaigns in selected districts saw a congressman or a senator defeated by simply flooding an area with information about how he was voting in Congress. Right? Is he voting for more taxation and more government, or is he voting for less taxation and less government? Right? And boy, did that ever do a job on some places. Right? We're about to rekindle that again and get it going again. We kept the United States from merging with Canada and Mexico as the first step in forming the equivalent of a European Union here in North America, which would be very easily merged into the United Nations and total government. Right? And lots more. We told the truth to the American people about the United Nations, that it wasn't a peace organization, but a war organization, and that it also was not a do-nothing bureaucracy, but an activist builder of the New World Order. I could go on, but I won't. How we work and how we intend to win is very simple, and I've explained it. Solid distribution of information about issues can sufficiently inform voters in a district, and these better informed people will choose better congressmen, better senators. If that process can be repeated in a district here, in a district there, and then in some others, the message will spread quickly throughout Congress that information is spreading. I better take a look at what I've been doing. They might start spreading out my record in my district. Right? We scared the wits out of a lot of congressmen, and we're going to do it again. Right? Men and women who want to be reelected will wonder how many Birches are in their district. Right? And what are the possibilities that information-based campaigns will be working the magic in that district? This is the society's process. In when was it? I don't know, 1970, I'd put the date here. The Federal Election Commission sued our organization to stop what we were doing. Right? We had to defend ourselves at a great monetary cost. The bogus claim stated that we had broken some federal laws by carrying on political activity and not registering with the Federal Election Commission, which of course is unconstitutional to begin with. You shouldn't have a Federal Election Commission. It should be left up state by state by state, right? Our defense was simply publishing the voting record of elected officials and was not political activity, but a matter of freedom of speech. We won a 9-judge unanimous decision in New York City. Imagine. Even in New York City, 9 judges took our side on it and chided the Federal Election Commission for harassing people and their free speech right. So this is the process. This is how we go about it. This is what we intend to do, how we want to win our country back. And of course, to do it, we need more people in the society. The same educational process that was working then can work again. But the first step to gain adherence to the Constitution by any member of Congress has always been to educate the people. Most congressmen who have a 2-year term immediately start running for re-election right after they get elected, right? That's the first task that they have, and they'll tell you, oh, yeah, I got to get re-elected, right? Well, if getting re-elected means you have to be a constitutional conservative, then some of them will do it. A lot of them will do it. And that's how we won. That's how we can win. Right? So can this be done? I believe it can be. I hope you agree. I hope you will want to be a part of saving our country. The John Birch Society's motto, less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Less government through adherence to the Constitution. More responsibility through stronger obedience to the 10 Commandments. Right? We're in favor of the 10 Commandments. And like the Constitution of the United States, the 10 Commandments are mostly thou shalt not. Right? And that's what the Constitution of the United States is. Thou shalt not. Right? More responsibility through obedience to the 10 Commandments, and a program based solely on honest education. In our view, the only other way out of where we are already is to expect God to intervene, and I don't think we have a right to demand that of God. Right? God help, my mother used to say, God helps those who help themselves, right? So I hope maybe some of you will join the John Birch Society. I can assure you, your children will think you and your country, will thank you and your country very much. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your close attention. And remember what I started with. We need more Dobermans. Thank you very much.